empowering the blind to be excellent, do more, and live with greater success. This show is for you and about you. Welcome to the Delivering Access Podcast. All right, welcome back, Delivering Access Podcast listeners. I am simply thrilled to welcome our guest, Mr. David Lepofsky. I did it wrong. What is that, David?
Lepofsky.
Absolutely. Are you prepared to empower?
Let's see what I can do.
Cool. So we'll get right into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became blind, where you grew up, and some of the tools that you've used along your journey.
All right. Well, I live in Toronto, Canada, where I've lived all my life, except for 1 year at graduate school in Boston. And I was born with partial vision in one eye and no vision in the other eye. And as a kid, I could ride a bike during the day. I wasn't supposed to at night, but that didn't stop me. And I could read print if I held it close to my nose. I was very nearsighted. Starting in my teens, that started going downhill. By the time I was in my late teens, I was totally blind and have been for the rest of my life, of course. And I am now at 56. My journey led me, I knew I think shortly after I hit the delivery table that I wanted to be a lawyer.
Okay.
And so I got into law school here, and in Toronto, I went to Osgoode Hall Law School, which is one of our big law schools here. Mm-hmm. I graduated from law in 1979 when I was 22. I did a master's of law at the Harvard Law School. And I came back, and I've been working here ever since as a lawyer, but my day job is nothing to do with disability or accessibility. But I got involved at a very early stage doing advocacy on disability issues, principally in a volunteer capacity. Back in the late 70s, the province of Ontario, where I live, that's provinces are equivalent to an American state, and we're the biggest province in Canada, and I live in Toronto, which is the biggest city in Canada. Mm-hmm. We had an anti-discrimination law that banned discrimination in areas like housing and employment and that sort of thing. But it didn't cover disability, and I got involved with a number of other people in a coalition that successfully fought to get disability included in our anti-discrimination law. It's called the Human Rights Code. Just at the end of my legal education, another thing happened that was just by sort of happenstance. Good luck. We'd had a constitution since we formed as a country in 1867, but it never included a Bill of Rights. And our then Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, decided that he wanted Canada to have a Bill of Rights. We call it a Charter of Rights. And it's largely modeled after the American Bill of Rights with some important differences. And as it was proposed, it included an equality provision, but the wording of it would not cover equality for people with disabilities. I and a number of other people advocated to get that changed. And in fact, before they passed the Charter of Rights into law, before it became part of our Constitution, the only right that was added to it that wasn't in the original draft was equality for people with disabilities. And I was really fortunate to be one of the many people who fought for it. In fact, if you go to YouTube and search on my name, David Lepofsky, and it's L-E-P like Peter, O-F-S-K-Y, you can actually see, among other things, a video of me when I was 22. I got to appear during public legislative hearings in Ottawa before the Parliament, arguing why disability should be included. I am told I look much younger, and back then I had a full head of hair, which I don't any longer. Anyway, and to make a long story very short, I got involved for many years as a volunteer, writing articles, teaching lawyers, judges, community groups in my spare time about making these rights in the Charter of Rights and the Human Rights Code work. And after time, I and others came to realize that they're really good rights, but they were not being honored as they should be. And we were influenced in the early 90s by the passage in the U.S. of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We decided to fight for a law like that in Ontario called the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And I ended up starting in 1994, we started a small coalition that grew into a very big coalition, covering all disabilities, not just vision loss. I mean, I've been totally blind, but we quickly branched out and covered all disabilities. And I served in a leadership capacity for that movement for 10 years. And in 2005, we won a law. It's called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA.
Mm-hmm.
And we already had, when we started this movement, we already had a number of the rights that the Americans with Disabilities Act had, but there's a number of things we didn't have. And the AODA is supposed to piece that up and maybe take us even further ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And I have since then led the coalition, and to this day, I should say, since that I was involved in the coalition that fought to get it implemented. Starting in 2009, I took on a leadership role in the successor coalition that is fighting to get that law effectively implemented. So that's something I do in my spare time.
All right. So, Mr. Lepofsky, how did I do? Did I do that?
You're doing much better, but just call me David. It's way easier.
Absolutely. I just wanted to get it right one time so that I could call you David. It's funny that you mentioned the coalition. I just been elected chairman of the Georgia statewide coalition on blindness. So briefly, give us your definition as an advocate, as you explained, of a coalition and kind of what that meant in Canada as far as working together for change.
Well, this is an interesting thing. We've had, Canada does not have the same tradition in the United States of kind of grassroots community organizing. That's not to say we don't have any, but we don't have, it's far more embedded in the United States. And there's sort of more of a tradition in Canada that we figure the government will kind of, they'll get it kind of right. And, but, you know, in the past 2-3 decades, more and more folks from different perspectives, not just a disability perspective, said, no, they're not going to get it right unless we get out there and we make our case. And there have been efforts, and some quite successful ones over the years in Canada, to organize organizations that advocate for one disability or another, and ones that advocate on a cross-disability basis. But the problem we have in Canada is that we're a very big country. We're bigger than the U.S. territorially, and we have 1/10 the population of the United States, so more land and 90% fewer people. So it's a bit of a challenge to pull everybody together and be effective. And what I found in my experience, and I'm not speaking for other folks, others may take a very different view, but I find that there are times that the most effective advocacy takes place when people with disabilities coalesce around a particular issue. So I got involved in '94 in a coalition that we had one objective, which was to get a law that would provide for a fully accessible and barrier-free province of Ontario. There are lots of other issues facing people with disabilities apart from accessibility, but we decided to take on, that one issue. And we found that worked for us. I'm not saying it's going to work for everyone, and I'm not saying it's the only way to go, but rather than being a permanent organization that tries to cover all disability issues, but we focused on one important one. And we found that, you know, people who wanted to work on other issues, they worked in other organizations, and that was great, and more power to them. But people who liked the agenda that we were putting forward, they jumped on board with us. And part of what I think makes a coalition successful, and I don't have absolutely anything against the blind people just advocating on a blindness issue. I think there are times for that, and it's important. Same with deaf people advocating on deafness-related issues. But what really worked for us, and I'm not preachy, I'm not saying other people should do it, I'm just saying what worked for us, was that we came up with a way to raise our issues that appealed to a wide spectrum of people with different disabilities. And instead of blind people talking about more braille and people in wheelchairs talking about more ramps and deaf people talking about more sign language interpretation, which lets the government try to divide us because we're all talking about different things, we came up with a way to talk about it all at the same time. We said we want a society with no barriers. And the barriers we face, some of them are physical barriers, like steps to get in a building. Some of it are communication barriers, like the lack of sign language interpretation when you go to the hospital. Some of the barriers you face are information barriers, like the failure of a bus driver to call out your route stops on a public transit bus route. And we said they're all barriers. And so what united all of us, whatever be our physical, mental, or sensory disability, was we all faced different barriers.
Mm-hmm.
And what we also found really worked that was really cool was when we talked about each other's barriers. So we might be at a public event, and one of our advocates who's in a wheelchair would talk about the need for more sign language, even though she didn't need sign language. And I would talk about the need for more ramps, even though I can walk and I don't need a ramp. And one of my colleagues who's deaf would talk about the need for more braille and elevator buttons, because we were all in it together. We made it clear to government that they weren't going to divide us based on our individual agendas, and that when we talk about each other's accommodations as they, that's what really made us an effective coalition.
Wow. And that definitely helped, because it's the area that I wanted to move into as we incorporate the deaf, blind, and hard of hearing into our coalition. And this is literally only about a week-old discussion as far as me becoming a chairperson. And,
right.
you know.
And if you think about it, by the way, what I just said applies even if you're just doing an organization with vision loss, because there are people with low vision,
Mm-hmm.
And they need large print. People who are totally blind like me couldn't care less personally about large print. I can't read it. And there are people who are deaf blind who need stuff that a hearing person who is blind might not need. And there are people who are maybe blind and are braille users, but there are lots of blind people who aren't braille users. So whichever way you build a coalition, you're always amalgamating different needs under a common umbrella, even if it's not a cross-disability movement. By the way, just as people are listening, if they are interested in learning more about what we're up to in Ontario, and we're always happy to hear people give us their ideas,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give people 3 ways to track us down. One is on the internet, on the web. We have a website where we post our most recent activity, and the website is AODA Alliance, AODAalliance.org. If they want to email us to sign up for our email updates, and we have people get our updates not just from across Ontario, but actually from around the world, send a request. It'll come to my attention, and our email address to use for me is AODA feedback, one word, AODA feedback at gmail.com. And the final thing people can do is follow us on Twitter. We have two Twitter handles. The same stuff comes out on both. They can follow either. There's either at AODA Alliance. I just remind people AODA is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Our coalition is the AODA Alliance, and I'm the chair. So at AODA Alliance, or at David Lepofsky, all one word, and DAVIDLE, P like Peter, O, F like Frank, SKY. And either way, we love to spread our information to folks around the country and around the world. And we're also always eager to get feedback from others around the world. You know, people read our stuff and they go, hey, you know, you're fighting for telephone internet voting in Ontario to help voters with disabilities and all voters be able to access the ballot. Hey, we're doing that too in our jurisdiction. We'd like to tell you what we've tried. You know, we welcome hearing from people. We think it's great to be able to share ideas and strategies.
Great. So I know you do a lot of advocacy work. What's one of your passions or desires for the blindness community?
Well, speaking, even though my coalition deals with cross-disability issues, I'll tell you a couple that I've been involved in. I actually personally, I mentioned earlier the problem of getting bus drivers to announce all route stops. Toronto is Canada's biggest city. We've got the Toronto Transit Commission as our country's biggest public transit authority. And I had to bring not one, but 2 separate discrimination claims against them to force them to audibly announce every route stop on a bus, a streetcar, or a subway. I won those cases. We made some real progress there. Mm-hmm. And the requirements that we won in Toronto have since been required by regulations for all Ontario public transit authorities under our Disabilities Act. So and we got feedback that there are a number of other public transit authorities around the country that are doing this more. as a result of that case. And what's been really interesting about that case is it's such a simple accommodation, but our transit authority fought like heck to oppose us and to oppose me in the case. Mm-hmm. The cases are called Lepofsky versus Toronto Transit Commission number 1 and number 2. But what's also been really interesting is when I won the case, like 2 cases, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, but most of it comes from sighted people because they too like the route stop announcements. They're reading the newspaper on the bus or the subway, or there's a crowd and they can't see through the crowd, or it's snowing outside. After all, I am in Canada, or it's nighttime and they can't see out. So it's actually become a fabulous way to illustrate that the accommodations that help us help everybody, and it isn't an us versus them thing. Now, I earlier mentioned what I think is an important agenda item that we're pushing for, and that would be the same kind of thing, and that is promoting telephone and internet voting for not only for voters with disabilities, but for all voters, because it would save the need to have to trek down to a polling station and arrange daycare if you got kids, and parking and all that stuff. For people with mobility disabilities, they could avoid the barriers they might face on the way. For people with fatiguing conditions, they wouldn't have to spend so much energy just to go and vote. And for people who are with vision loss or dyslexia, it would actually let us mark our own ballot. We don't have voting machines like you have in the States. Mm-hmm. We mark a piece of paper, and we've had historically to have somebody else mark our ballot for us, which destroys the private vote. I have to tell somebody else who I'm voting for. Our government in Ontario, facing this request, came up with a compromise, which is to have they got an accessible voting machine that we can use, but they only had one per electoral district, and there's 107 or so in Ontario. And so that means having to hike some distance, unlike your peers who can vote at a polling station just around the corner. And so we've said that, that's not fair. And there should be telephone and internet voting, not just for us, but for everybody. We think it would be popular for young people, for people who don't want to trek to the polling station because it's too difficult for them, whatever. I regret that we have run into a real roadblock. We have something you don't have in most of your states, which is we have an independent agency that administers our elections. And for the most part, that's a good thing, because it's not governed by any particular political party. And so they manage the whole voting process. And that part's really good. But our problem is that our electoral agency, it's called Elections Ontario, did a study on telephone internet voting as a result of a legislative lobby that we mounted. They had a mandate that they could even test pilot it during what's called a by-election, an election in individual riding, if a member of the legislature has stepped down or died or whatever. And they refused to test pilot it, and up till now, and they wrote a report which really it was a slap in the face to us. It was very negative, and we think unfair in putting off pretty much indefinitely telephone and internet voting. They studied for 3 years, and their recommendation is, gee, this needs more study. And we say, no, it doesn't. It needs action. But anyway, that's just one of many, many barriers that we're focusing on, which would be of particular interest to people with vision loss. But we're involved with a wide range of issues. We're right now trying to get the government to develop new accessibility regulations in the area of access to education and access to healthcare and access to residential housing. And those 3 areas we think are particularly important and need government action.
Mm-hmm. So you do a lot of advocacy. You're an attorney, and I would imagine you have a very, very busy day. What mainstream tools or assistive technologies are you using to make these things happen each day?
Well, that's a very good question. I am I use a PC, Windows based. I have been using JAWS for about 11 years. I used to use, this is going to test the memory of some of your audience, but I used to use products by Synthavoice Computers Window Bridge, and it was a Canadian screen reader. The fellow who created it was a blind fellow from Hamilton, Ontario, and a dear friend named David Lepofsky. It was a fabulous product. Unfortunately, David's death came quite untimely when he was quite a young man back in 2001, and with the end of David was the end of his product, in effect. But he was actually created the first screen reader that made Windows accessible. When Windows first came out, it was completely inaccessible to blind people. And David Lepofsky's products, he should really be honored in the blind community as a real pioneer for us. I mean, people all know about system access and JAWS and Window Eyes and VDA and so on. It's just a given that there are all these screen readers. But back then, there were none. They only worked in the DOS environment. He was the first one to conquer Windows. But anyway, with his death and the end of his product, I eventually moved to JAWS. I've been using it. I'm very active on Twitter. I've been using the Cube as my Twitter access technology. I'm not a heavy Braille user because I lost my vision in my teens, and as often is the case, people who learn to read print first will make some use of Braille, but not with the proficiency of someone for whom Braille is their first reading language. I don't have a guide dog. I use a white cane. I did train in the mid-'70s on a fabulous electronic travel aid called the Sonic Guide. Again, that will test everybody's memory for the older folks listening. There's a pair of eyeglasses with a sonar sensor in it that sent out a beam of ultrasound, reflected it back, and you heard it in stereo in the ear couplings. I still have my Sonic Guide. I haven't really used it in a long time. Sadly, they don't make this product anymore. The brilliant man who created it, Dr. Leslie Kay in New Zealand, eventually they came out with a successor called the K Sonar, named after him, and it's monaural. It's a single handheld or cane-mounted device. But I think there's huge room for more of these environmental sensor devices. I know that there's work being done on some of them. I've read about it, I've seen it on Twitter, but I think that they're a great way of adding the information flow that we all have. I do, of course, have an iPhone, which I'm talking to you on right now. And I have, since I got it about a year ago, been making very active use of any and every app I can get my hands on. As we all want to do, and you end up with more apps and you got time to figure them out. But I still, my PC, I use a laptop. I haven't had a desktop computer since about 1999. I just have a PC and it goes wherever I go. Pardon me, a laptop and it goes wherever I go, and it's all my knowledge in one place.
Wonderful. Well, David, we've reached my favorite part of the show. The thunder moment. And this is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back with brief and to the point responses. Sounds like a plan?
Wait, you want a lawyer to be brief and to the point? Come on. I'll see what I can do.
Okay, cool. So, who was your mentor growing up?
It's not actually an individual. I'm a Star Trek fan, and I grew up in the 60s watching the original Star Trek series, and my hero was Mr. Spock.
All right.
And it's wrong to say that he had no emotion. He was trying to master his emotions by governing it by logic. And I won't say I try to master my emotions, but I think logic is still a powerful tool. It's certainly what we lawyers use all the time, or try to.
What was Star Trek's best advice to you?
Star Trek's best advice to me, you know what? The fellow who created it, Gene Roddenberry, had a real vision of optimism for people's future. And I have always carried that with me. When we started our Disability Act movement in 1994, any rational person would say we didn't have a hope of success of ever winning the legislation we were fighting for. And I'm an eternal optimist. No matter how many roadblocks we face, no matter how many uphill battles we face in dealing with the government or with opposition parties or wherever it may be, I remain an eternal optimist, and I got that from Star Trek.
Okay, cool. So, as we know, life is full of roller coasters, both big and small. Tell us about a up and or a down that you've had as an individual that has been blind and on this ride for as long as you have been blind.
Wow, that's a fabulous question. There have been lots of ups. I mean, my view is every time we get communities pulled together, or I see a letter to the editor in the newspaper, or I meet somebody who'd never done disability advocacy before, had, not somebody like me who's a lifelong advocate on this stuff, and I see them get out there and fight the good fight. For me, that's always a big up, and that really inspires me. I think our most effective advocates are our least experienced people in doing advocacy. I think it's moms and dads and kids and anybody, whether they got a disability or whether they got somebody near them and dear them who they care about who have a disability. And every time I'm able to see them get on the radio or on TV or ask a question to a politician, for me, that's a big up. What are the downs? Listen, we've had a lot of downs in our fight. When it took us 10 years to get our legislation, there were a lot of times we'd make our pitch and you'd take a story to a newspaper and they wouldn't run it, or a TV show and they wouldn't run it, or you get an interview and then they recorded it and it didn't go to air. And there's a lot of times when you put in your effort and you don't get any results. And I've learned to sort of grit my teeth and just keep on going. But there are lots of those. And one of the things that I've learned is to take a disadvantage and turn it into an advantage. Every time a newspaper won't run a story, I'll come back to them again, and the next time say, "Hey, listen, I gave you a good story the last time you turned it down. Now it's our turn." So it's my view is take every bad situation and turn it to your advantage. There's always a way.
Absolutely. So, the innovations in technology going on for the blind right now, what's exciting you the most?
Can I tell you something? I look at it through I meet young people who are just in law school right now who are blind. And I think when I tell them what it was like when I was in law school, I feel like what it was like when I was a kid and we'd hear about our great-grandparents who used to use horse and buggy to get to school or to work, and before there was the airplane. I mean, I tell them I used to type my exams on an ink print typewriter, and sometimes the ribbon broke and I'm writing my law exam answers and there's nothing on the page, and I didn't know it, okay, because this is before the talking computer. The fact that when I was in law school in the 70s, I'd have volunteer readers, who'd read about 4 hours a week beyond what I already had recorded on tape. Yes, I used tape. And so 4 hours of reading is 100 pages. So I had to choose the 100 most important pages to read beyond what was in the books I already had for my courses. I now look at the fact that on your iPhone or on your laptop or whatever, you can access a virtually unlimited quantity of printed material and carry it around in your pocket. I mean, when I was starting in law school, I used a reel-to-reel tape recorder that was 2 feet long. You don't put that in your pocket.
Right.
So that what I'm saying is that the advances now, I mean, right now you can carry a document scanner that folds up and you put it in your briefcase and plug it into your laptop, so that the amount of time it takes to access a piece of printed information, a sheet of paper or a page in a book, it was about 10 or 15 seconds, anywhere, anytime, as long as you got that equipment with you. That's sure not what it was like when I was a kid, and that was not what we imagined it would be like, until 300 years later in Star Trek. So, and that's the growth of technology up to now. I've often thought if my friend David Lepofsky had lived, he was always thinking about what was coming next, because he had to come up with the next version of a screen reader to conquer it. Mm-hmm. And if he had lived another 12 years to see the fact that, we didn't need, a big, huge desktop computer could fit in your pocket, and it'd also happen to be your phone. he would have been amazed and delighted and thinking about what's coming next.
Wow. So, your advice to a person who's just become blind, what would it be to help them overcome their fear?
What would be my advice to them is, number one, I'm going to say lots of us have done it. And if it seems like it's not doable because you used to rely on your eyesight, I will tell you that every person who walked into law school sighted or blind on their first day can't imagine that they're ever going to be a lawyer. They don't know anything about it. They're scared. They're nervous. 3 years later, they unless they flunk out, and very small numbers do, they come out and they become a lawyer and they have a huge law career. Mm-hmm. That's the nature of life, is looking forward at something and thinking, no, there's no way I could do it. It doesn't make any sense. Sure, other people have done it, but I can't. But we do. And the thing is that there are tools there. You just take it one step at a time. And that's the way we've done our advocacy. Can I tell you something? There was a day in May in 2005 that was amazing. It was the day that our Disability Act was going to be voted for the final vote, and it was going to be passed into law. And we knew it would be passed because all the political parties had said they would vote for it. All the lobbying was done. Everything was done but showing up for the big event. And before I went out to lunch with a friend of mine who is sighted, and we went to a Chinese restaurant. And at the end of the meal, they gave me a fortune cookie. Now, of course, I eat the thing, and I handed a piece of paper over to my friend because, of course, they haven't come up with a fortune cookie in Braille, because it would have to be so big it would be a fortune cake. That's not a bad idea, by the way. But in any event, my friend looked at this fortune, and it was like amazing. It was utterly amazing. The words on the fortune were every great accomplishment is at first impossible. And I actually mentioned that fortune cookie at the press conference we held that day, and I've mentioned it in speech after speech I've given on it, because whether you're personally coping with addressing vision loss for the first time and figuring out this looks impossible, or you are taking on forming a coalition in a fractious community that you got to help work together to work together, and then you have to face political parties that don't know you, the media who don't know you, the public that's worried about other things. It looks impossible, but every great accomplishment in anyone's life is just like that. It looks like it's impossible to start. And any of us who are listening to anybody on this podcast or listening to this podcast, they've adjusted to vision loss, that they'll, I'm sure, think that from their early days. The folks who are the interesting perspective are the people who are born with vision loss, because for them, there's no adjustment. For them, this is just natural life, and what's all the fuss about? Mm-hmm. That's just the world that they're in. But it's a different world for people who had vision, relied on it, and now have to learn the ways for addressing it. There are more tools available now than ever before in history, and they're cheaper, and they're better, and they're easier to learn. And 10, 20 years from now, it's going to be the tools we look at now. We're going to look that will be used then. Will probably make what we're using today look as primitive as me typing on that typewriter and having a ribbon break, 35 years ago.
I know that's right. Well, David, this interview has truly, truly been very insightful, to say the least. Unfortunately, we've reached the end. So tell us how we can reach you. Give us one parting piece of advice, and then we'll say goodbye.
All right. Number one, email AODA feedback@gmail.com, either to get in touch or to ask to sign up for our updates. If you want to get our updates, just say sign me up. Twitter is @David Lepofsky, LEPOFSKY, or @AODA Alliance. Either one gets you the same information, so whichever you prefer. And check out our website, www.aodaalliance.org. And my parting advice is to everybody is life is all about taking opportunities to turn things around. One of the more fun moments I had was about back in 2003. There was a huge power blackout that spread from Ontario to New York to Ohio and all the way around the East Coast. Mm-hmm. And it was about 4 p.m, and I decided just I thought it was actually mostly fun. I called our major radio network, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, and they patched me through the newsroom. They said, "What's your story?" I said, "I'm blind." They said, "Well, what are the issues that you have to face in this blackout?" I said, "I don't have any. You guys will." And I said, "Would you like some tips from a blind person on what to do tonight?" So they put me right on the air, and the reporter there was no rehearsing, there were no notes, there was no nothing. It was a lot of fun. It was probably, of all the media I've ever done, it was the most fun I've had doing an interview. And it was blind people reaching out saying, "Hey." In this case, me reaching out and saying, "Hey, folks, we've been there. Here's some tips. Pick up your kids' toys because you're going to find them tonight the hard way. Those half-open doors, you better keep them right open or keep them completely closed. You got medication, when you can find it, set it up now because tonight you're not going to be able to." Anyway, I will tell you, I really enjoyed doing the interview. I got a lot of humorous feedback on it and enjoyable feedback, but it was about taking the opportunities to me, it was about taking the opportunity to take to reach out and say, "Hey, we're all in it together, and you have lots to offer us, and we got lots to offer you." I think that's that may help people out.
And I'm just picturing this interview, and wow, I mean that's fun for me hearing it.
You know what? The only problem, which is very unfortunate, is because of the power blackout, the CBC recording of it never got lost, so I don't even have a copy of it to play for anyone.
All right.
But anyway, no, it was. But that's I'm not the first blind person who's had fun during a blackout, raising the fact that we can find our way around and others can't. But it was just But that's one of the messages that my accessibility campaign, our accessibility campaign, has raised over and over, is that what helps us helps everyone.
Absolutely.
So it isn't what they can do for us; it's often what we can do for everybody.
Great message. Well, as I stated, unfortunately, we have to say goodbye. But again, this was just an amazing interview. It helped me in so many ways. Being a newly I won't say ordained, but voted in leader, and having to walk in some big footsteps, you've definitely given me some advice, some hope, and some encouragement through your walks in Canada. So at this time, I'd like to thank Aaron Linkson, our podcast producer and sound engineer, David Lepofsky, got it right this time.
Sure did.
Our honored guest, and we'll say goodbye.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really honored by the opportunity to speak to you.
Not a problem. In my traditional closing, if you think you can, or if you think you can't, you are right. Think pennies, get pennies. Think dollars, get dollars. See you on the other side.
This has been a Yuga Music Group production. Website 81x.com/Yuga/X. The Yuga Music Group can be reached at 678-608-8969. All rights reserved.